Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in St. Louis. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. Let's begin. In the autumn of 1890, the city of St. Louis, already sprawling and industrial, still booming as a rail hub and river port in the post-Reconstruction era, felt the undercurrent of something darker beneath its urban gutters. According to city directories and Board of Health notices, St. Louis in that period was also beset by rapid growth, overcrowding, and the kind of social pressures that older records say left the poorer neighborhoods vulnerable to unseen harms. Wikipedia +1 at the edge of the city's western fringe. Beyond the gas-lit lanes and horse-drawn carts, near a small cemetery that local mourners called Grave Hill, the brothers Ambrose and Warren Galloway moved into a neglected property in October. The listing in the handwritten ledger of property transfers for the county shows that Ambrose Galloway purchased the house and grounds from a faded estate of the late Dr. Cornelius Draper, a physician whose reputation had quietly suffered after a string of unexplained death certificates. The address was unassuming, a narrow two-story brick in the shadow of the elevated railway, with a cellar door that opened onto damp soil. Witnesses at the time described the Galloways as quiet, polite but strange, as recorded in a sworn testimony by Mrs. Hester McElroy of Maplewood Avenue, dated 5 November 1890. She recalled, "They came at dusk with no announcement, and the local children said they whispered beneath the churchyard oaks. The first impression of their arrival offered a subtle cue that the siblings' ambition might lie outside the ordinary. By November's frost, the cellar was being bricked in, windows shuttered, and faint smells of antiseptic and something like burnt peat emanated from behind the wood paneling." One of the city inspectors, J.H. Langdon, noted in his rounding report, "A strange odor from the property. House appears tidy but locked after 6 in the evening. Neighbors absent on errands." The scene setting was cold, quiet, and already felt wrong. As winter thickened over St. Louis that year, the Galloway house became a subject of quiet fascination and dread. The neighboring grocer, Mr. Elijah Boone, testified years later that the twins kept to themselves, yet somehow always seemed to be returning from the direction of Calvary Cemetery after midnight. He said their wagon wheels left twin grooves in the frost, narrow, deliberate, and often carrying something heavy beneath a canvas sheet. In the local newspaper, the Missouri Republican, a brief December notice mentioned a pair of medical suppliers operating without license in the Western District. The note made no direct accusation but warned of vile rumors regarding the mishandling of interred remains. That single line, buried among columns of shipping prices and river conditions, was later underlined in a city clerk's copy, suggesting that officials suspected more than they admitted. The year 1890 was marked by industrial unrest and political anxiety, as documented in the History of St. Louis, 1866-1904. Population growth had strained the municipal health system. Hospital records showed shortages of teaching cadavers at Washington University's medical department. That uncomfortable shortage, historians note, created a silent demand, one that unscrupulous suppliers could exploit. The Galloways, according to whispers recorded in a coroner's notebook, had once apprenticed under Dr. Draper, whose estate they later acquired. It was said he taught them the practical anatomy of necessity. By January 1891, funerals at Grave Hill began to draw uneasy glances. Mourners returned weeks later to find soil disturbed and coffins shifted askew. One gravedigger, Samuel Kern, claimed he saw 2 lanterns moving slow as breath among the tombstones, but when he approached, the lights vanished. The constable dismissed the account as imagination brought on by whiskey and long hours. Though his own report hinted otherwise, the ground bore the prints of a wagon wheel, though no tracks led away. Inside the Galloway residence, few visitors were ever admitted. The postman said deliveries stopped at the door. A hand would appear briefly, gloved and silent, to collect the parcels. The chimney smoked at odd hours, and sometimes, this from Mrs. McElroy's second affidavit, a faint metallic ringing echoed at dawn, like a surgeon sharpening an instrument on stone. One evening in late February, a laborer from the rail yard, injured by a fall, claimed he was taken to the brother's house for treatment. He never returned. His wife reported him missing, but the city marshal postponed any search, insisting the man may have fled his debts. By spring thaw, dogs began howling at night near the property, and children refused to pass the lane after sundown. A local pastor, Reverend Orville Sykes, noted in his Sunday journal, "Evil grows from neglect, and something in that quarter festers unseen." The Galloways, meanwhile, seemed calm, greeting neighbors by day, vanishing by night. Their composure, their politeness only deepened the fear. By the summer of 1891, St. Louis simmered under a heavy heat that clung to the riverfront and filled the narrow streets with a smell of sweat, coal, and decay. The city's Board of Health was still struggling to modernize its mortuary practices, something also mentioned in the History of St. Louis, 1866-1904, which describes how the overcrowded graveyards of that decade forced new, sometimes hasty burials on the outskirts. It was precisely in those neglected corners that the Galloway brothers found opportunity. Reports began filtering into the coroner's office of displaced markers, shallow graves, and families petitioning for reburial after discovering empty coffins. The name Galloway was never written outright in those records, but annotations in the margins, initials AG and WG, appeared beside several investigations. Clerks later swore they were ordered to ignore the pattern. One letter, preserved in the personal correspondence of Coroner E.J. Dempster, reads, "Someone within the faculty is paying cash for fresh material, and our town diggers know whose door to knock." Whether that referred to the Galloways or to other resurrection men of the time is unclear, but the phrasing echoes through later testimonies. A city inspector named Langdon revisited the property that June. In his report, discovered decades later among sealed archives, he wrote, "Strong chemical odor, lower floor secured by iron latch, voices heard within though only one shadow moved." He requested a warrant for inspection, but the magistrate delayed action, perhaps persuaded by a donation the brothers had recently made to the local hospital's charity fund. Meanwhile, near the western cemetery boundary, laborers laying telegraph cable unearthed a cluster of bones. The bones were stripped clean, stacked in a crate lined with old newspaper sheets dated March 1891. The printing plate mark on one scrap matched that of the Missouri Republican, its very issue, carrying a brief note about missing medical specimens from the university. Coincidence, perhaps, but when shown to Professor Harold Raines, a physician associated with the school, he turned pale and declined to comment. Among townsfolk, stories multiplied. Some said the twins practiced unholy experiments. Others whispered of a doctor's ledger, filled with coded initials and payments. A washerwoman named Clara Beale claimed she delivered linen to the house and glimpsed an arm laid out upon a table, gloved at the wrist. Officials dismissed her statement as hysteria, yet her description matched an entry later found in a surgeon's supply manifest, "One preserved limb, anatomical. By August, pressure built." Constable Archer Hume, recently returned from sick leave, agreed to serve a late-night summons on the brothers. When he knocked, no one answered. Through a side window, he saw candlelight flicker, and a figure stooped over what looked like a ledger. Moments later, the flame vanished. He reported, all quiet thereafter. But the smell, like earth and medicine, mixed. The next morning, the brothers were gone. By early September 1891, when the first official search of the Galloway property commenced, the air over St. Louis had turned heavy with storms. Rain slicked the cobblestones outside the narrow brick house on Maplewood Avenue. According to the affidavit of Constable Archer Hume, the door yielded after a single firm blow with the shoulder. Inside, the room smelled of lime and lamp oil. Curtains were drawn, and every mirror was draped with a white cloth. The front parlor held little more than an iron-legged table and two straight-backed chairs. But in the cellar, half flooded from the storm, they found what later reports called a workspace of unlicensed anatomy. Barrels stood in rows, their contents packed in brine. Ledger fragments written in precise script listed names beside sums of money and cryptic initials. Hume recorded no trace of occupants, contents consistent with recent surgical dissection. No sign of struggle. A doctor from the city infirmary, Dr. Lyman Pierce, was summoned to inventory the evidence. His notes mention 5 partial remains, likely exhumed within the month. In one barrel lay a child's shoe, still laced, pressed flat against the curve of the wood. The report never reached open court. Its delivery was halted by an order from the municipal board, the same one that the history of St. Louis, 1866-1904, later cited as struggling to maintain jurisdiction over private cemeteries' neighbors, gathered outside as officers carried out the barrels under canvas. Rain washed the gutters red-brown, and one witness, Mrs. McElroy, said she heard a sound like glass breaking below the thunder. When questioned, she could not tell whether it came from the house or the sky. By midnight, the property was sealed. Yet within 24 hours, someone forced entry again. A watchman reported the back door open, cellar emptied, and every ledger page gone. Only a single item remained, a brass locket containing a miniature photograph of 2 boys, identical faces, perhaps 12 years old, dressed in school uniform. On the reverse was etched a motto in Latin, Ex terra lux, from the earth light. The press caught wind of the affair. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch ran a cautious headline, "Anatomists missing, evidence of profanation." Officials downplayed it as an unfortunate misunderstanding of medical procedure, but editorials hinted otherwise. Letters to the editor accused city authorities of shielding a known procurer of anatomical material. Constable Hume resigned 2 weeks later. In a sworn statement, he said, "We were told not to look further west of the railway line." He left town soon after and was reportedly seen in Kansas City under another name. By winter's return, the Galloway house stood empty. Boards nailed across windows, frost blooming along the mortar. Passers-by claimed to smell disinfectant when the wind shifted, though no one had entered for months. The property remained under city hold until one night the house caught fire. Flames rose straight up, leaving only the stone foundation and the black mouth of the cellar. In the weeks that followed the fire, the Galloway property drew a steady stream of investigators, journalists and morbidly curious onlookers. Rain flattened the ashes, and smoke clung stubbornly to the blackened stones. What little remained was sifted carefully into wooden crates labeled, "For City Evidence." Among the charred remnants, the constable recovered fragments of surgical instruments fused by heat, and something resembling a jawbone, warped but unmistakably human. A city clerk named Eustace Bell transcribed the property's inventory and noted at the bottom of his page, "Unclear if remains belong to same party." He later added, in a margin, "Suspected to be multiple." The handwriting slanted, hurried, as if he'd written it in poor light. A separate memorandum, archived in the county vault, referenced the Galloway investigation directly, tying it to an earlier case of grave tampering on record with the city's public health department, again echoing the municipal troubles cited in the history of St. Louis, 1866-1904 rumors, multiplied through taverns and newspaper columns. Some blamed rival doctors seeking revenge. Others claimed the brothers perished in the blaze, their bodies reduced to soot, but no bodies were found. The theory that they had fled west took hold after a telegraph operator in Jefferson City reported 2 men, resembling undertakers, purchasing train tickets under false names. The description, tall, clean-shaven, wearing dark coats, fit almost any gentleman of the day, yet the timing was damning. Meanwhile, the churchyards emptied. Families rushed to exhume loved ones for verification, uncovering more empty boxes than anyone expected. In one disturbing account, a coffin was found weighted with river stones, its lining cut with precision. The clergy called for fasting and prayer. The newspapers demanded resignations from the city coroner. Dr. Lyman Pierce, who had catalogued the cellar remains, resigned quietly and left for Illinois. His departure letter contained a single cryptic line. "The brothers served a purpose our city dared not name." Scholars later linked this remark to the known practice of anatomical procurement, a polite phrase for grave robbing in service of medical education. The history of St. Louis, 1866-1904, mentions the university's struggle to secure legal cadavers during precisely this decade, lending grim plausibility to Pierce's words. By early 1892, the Galloway case had been officially closed. "No living suspects identified," read the file header. Yet witnesses kept coming forward, Rail workers, farmers, even a ferryman who swore he transported two pale gentlemen carrying sealed crates upriver after midnight. The crates, he claimed, gave off a cold smell like clay. Within months, the river rose in flood, sweeping away parts of the western cemetery and scattering coffins downstream. Locals said it was divine retribution. Officials called it coincidence. Either way, the evidence was gone, buried again by the same river that had built the city's fortune. The panic that gripped St. Louis through the winter of 1892 was unlike any the city had known. Rumors festered faster than officials could suppress them. In taverns along the levee, men swore that police wagons rolled after midnight to unmarked lots. Carrying back the evidence of science, ministers thundered that hell itself had opened beneath the city. The mayor's office issued a terse statement calling the stories gross exaggerations. Yet even civic leaders privately admitted that something foul had been buried, figuratively and otherwise, under municipal paperwork. Letters preserved in the courthouse archive reveal a steady correspondence between the Board of Health and the city's medical college. In one dated April 1892, an administrator warned, "We must ensure all future acquisitions bear traceable documentation, lest the Galloway affair rise again." The line, dry and bureaucratic, betrayed how deeply the scandal had bitten. The History of St. Louis, 1866-1904, later remarked that such incidents pushed local authorities to reform burial licensing entirely. Despite the official calm, unease pervaded daily life. Funerals drew watchful crowds. Grave diggers were required to register each coffin with stamped certificates. Vendors of quicklime and formaldehyde reported customers asking intrusive questions about stock. One undertaker even installed a night guard armed with a lantern and shotgun, saying the dead ought to rest once buried. Detective J.E. Moran, newly assigned to reopen the Galloway file, traced financial ledgers from the burned house to a banking office on Olive Street. The account, under the name Warren Gray, showed regular deposits corresponding to academic semesters. The pattern was unmistakable, money each spring and autumn matching the university's anatomy term. When Moran presented his findings to the chief clerk, the page was quietly removed from evidence and replaced with one dated years prior. Soon after, Moran resigned for health reasons. Meanwhile, strange accounts continued. A gravedigger at Bellefontaine Cemetery reported hearing a wooden clatter beneath newly turned soil, empty coffin lids knocking together in a single grave. Farmers west of the city found their ponds fouled by medical waste, jars bobbing like ghostly candles on the surface. The newspapers grew bolder, naming certain learned men as accessories after the fact. The Post-Dispatch editorialized, "Knowledge, when divorced from decency, breeds its own pestilence." By summer, a quiet purge swept through St. Louis's medical community. Professors retired abruptly, laboratories closed for renovation, and entire sets of anatomy records disappeared from archives. One article hinted that two brothers of pale complexion had been seen boarding a riverboat under assumed identities bound for Vicksburg. Whether this was fact or fancy, no authority pursued it. The official narrative became that the matter was handled, the city purified. Yet for years afterward, residents near the burned foundations swore the ground never cooled. On humid nights, vapor rose from the cellar pit, and dogs whined before bolting into the dark. The ruins remained fenced off, though no new owner ever claimed the lot. By 1893, the story of the Galloway twins had left the realm of police records and settled into folklore. Each district in St. Louis told it differently. In some, the brothers were spirits who lured gravediggers to their deaths. In others, they were still alive, operating under new names in river towns to the south. The city's more respectable citizens preferred not to mention them at all, treating the matter as an unfortunate embarrassment of the previous administration. Yet in back rooms and boarding houses, people still lowered their voices when speaking of the night doctors. The St. Louis Historical Society held a discreet meeting that May to determine which documents could be safely preserved. Among the sealed minutes was a statement from an elderly clerk who insisted the ledgers taken from the Galloway cellar were incomplete. There was a second book, he said, one that listed institutions, not names. The remark, dismissed at the time, resurfaced years later when academics studying the city's medical reforms found references to supplementary procurement contracts. The history of St. Louis, 1866–1904, acknowledges such reforms as vital to restoring public confidence, though it makes no mention of the brothers themselves, only of scandals surrounding the anatomical supply. The public's imagination, however, needed no footnotes. Schoolchildren dared one another to walk past the burnt foundation after dark. Riverboat workers claimed to see twin silhouettes on the levee at dawn, waiting silently for barges heavy with freight. And in the boarding house, where Constable Hume once stayed, a new tenant reported hearing footsteps pacing above his ceiling at precisely the hour the fire had started 2 years before. For the authorities, these stories were a nuisance. The city marshal ordered the ruins filled with rubble and fenced to discourage further trespass. Yet curiosity persisted. Amateur spiritualists held midnight seances at the site, speaking of restless physicians seeking atonement. A reporter for the Globe Democrat attended one such gathering and later wrote, "There was no voice from the pit, only the steady hiss of steam from the sewer line below. But the smell of lime was still there." By autumn, a professor of pathology at Washington University, Dr. Edwin Harcourt, requested permission to review the remaining evidence. His letter cited the educational necessity of understanding prior abuses to prevent recurrence. Approval was granted under strict supervision. Harcourt's private notes, later recovered from his estate, described one object of particular interest, a brass locket retrieved from police storage, engraved Ex Terra Lux. Inside, the photograph of 2 young boys had faded almost to nothing, leaving faint outlines like burn marks on metal. Harcourt remarked, "Their faces seem less identical now. One smiles faintly, the other does not." Within weeks of viewing the evidence, Harcourt abruptly left his post, claiming poor health. He never published his promised paper on the affair, and his students reported he refused to discuss the twins thereafter. By the turn of 1894, the legend of the Galloways had taken firm root, but it was an archivist, not a storyteller, who stirred it again. A quiet man named Philip Renner, recently hired to reorganize the Public Health Department's files, discovered a misfiled packet labeled Anatomical Correspondence, Confidential. Inside were several soot-stained pages, apparently rescued from the fire. The handwriting matched the brothers' careful script, tall letters, narrow spacing, and the same phrase recurring at the bottom of each entry, Ex Terra Lux. Renner's discovery reignited official unease. Though much of the city had moved on, the department's director feared renewed scandal. He ordered the files resealed, but not before Renner copied fragments into his notebook. These copies, preserved later by his family, mention deliveries to Faculty Room No. 3 and payments to an unnamed intermediary who signed only with the initial D. Some historians suspect this referred to Dr. Cornelius Draper, the physician who once owned the Galloway property. His earlier fall from grace, recorded obliquely in hospital minutes, suddenly seemed less an end than a handoff. Local papers revived the tale, linking it to other disappearances along the river. A reporter for the Republic claimed an informant described 2 pale men passing through Cairo, Illinois, selling medical supplies. The article offered no proof, yet public imagination seized it. By summer, the words Galloway trade became shorthand for any grim rumor about the body business. The renewed attention drew scholars, including a young historian from the university named Clara Mendel. She petitioned access to the sealed city archives to write a paper on the ethics of anatomical acquisition in postbellum America. Her supervisor denied permission, but Mendel persisted, citing the same civic reform period detailed in the history of St. Louis, 1866–1904. In correspondence later found among her effects, she wrote, "To understand our city's progress, one must study its shadows." By September 1894, Mendel succeeded in viewing the remaining evidence. She described the cellar, sketches included in the recovered packet, outlines of human figures dissected in stages, not as medical diagrams, but as diagrams of motion, arms, torsos, heads, each drawn as if recording the sequence of decay. She concluded the brothers were not merely suppliers, but experimenters seeking to measure dissolution. Her draft article vanished after she submitted it for review. The editor claimed never to have received it. That autumn, a heavy rain collapsed the last section of foundation at the old site. The exposed soil revealed what witnesses described as a cavity lined with brick and iron hooks. City engineers ordered it filled immediately. Workmen said the pit smelled faintly of ether, though no residue was found. In the months that followed, Mendel resigned from the university and left for Boston. Those who spoke to her last said she seemed shaken, often glancing over her shoulder during conversation. One colleague remembered her final remark: "They were never looking for death, they were looking for light." Between 1895 and 1900, the legend of the Galloways refused to rest, reappearing in curious bursts every few months, like a bad memory surfacing through polite conversation. City residents who had lived near the old foundation began reporting strange disturbances, knocking beneath the soil during heavy rain, a faint light that glowed from the ground itself, or the occasional odor of formalin carried by the wind. The authorities blamed sewer leaks, though engineers found no breach in the pipes. Meanwhile, the city archives quietly expanded. Clerk Philip Renner, now promoted to deputy registrar, began cataloguing death certificates from the 1880s to reconcile missing records. To his dismay, entire years bore unexplained gaps. Burial permits numbered out of order, names repeated, signatures forged. In one ledger, he found the initials AG scrawled faintly beside the entry for an unidentified male, age approx. 40, recovered from the Mississippi in 1896. The man's features had been too degraded for recognition, but a silver pocket watch with twin engravings, WG and AG, was logged with the remains. The record was never released to the press. That same year, a traveling photographer named Henry Cobb advertised scientific curiosities at a small exhibition near the riverfront. Among his daguerreotypes were several images depicting dissection rooms and skeletal studies. One photograph, when enlarged by the Post-Dispatch's printing department, revealed two men in the background, standing too still for ordinary assistance. Cobb insisted they were mannequins, yet his description of their attire, dark coats, matching gloves, and identical height, was enough to set the rumor mill churning again. Local clergy seized the opportunity. Sermons warned against the return of the body snatchers, urging citizens to guard their cemeteries vigilantly. Ironically, such sermons drew larger crowds than Sunday Mass, and vendors began selling cheap prints titled "The Grave Snatchers of St. Louis." Each version exaggerated the tale. In some, the brothers were executed and buried alive. In others, they escaped to Europe. Still, the kernel of truth, corruption, secrecy, and missing dead, remained untouched. In 1898, during a routine clearing of the city poorhouse cellar, workers uncovered several medical crates sealed with wax. Inside were preserved human specimens labeled with numbers rather than names. Dr. Edwin Harcourt, once associated with the university's pathology department, was summoned to authenticate the collection. According to the minutes of the inquiry, he refused to touch the contents, stating only, "These were never ours." He resigned a second time the following week and vanished from public record. By century's end, even the skeptics conceded that too many coincidences had aligned. The History of St. Louis, 1866 to 1904, compiled soon afterward, recorded the era as one of progress shadowed by scandal, noting diplomatically that the acquisition of anatomical material occasionally challenged both law and morality. No direct mention of the Galloways appears, but the phrasing suggests the editors chose discretion over revelation. When the new century dawned, few living residents remembered the twins firsthand. Yet on foggy nights along the riverbank, fishermen still claimed to hear wagon wheels grinding faintly against cobblestones, always in pairs, always heading west, as if some unfinished errand awaited beyond the city lights. As the 20th century crept in, St. Louis reshaped itself with electric streetlights and brick factories, but the Galloway affair lingered like a stubborn stain no ordinance could scrub away. By 1901, only a few officials who had touched the original files were still alive, and most refused interviews. Deputy Registrar Philip Renner, now white-haired and frail, occupied a corner desk in the new municipal archive on Market Street. His final project was to micro-index every death certificate issued before 1895, yet he confessed privately that gaps still whispered between the pages. The city's expansion swallowed the old graveyards. Rail tracks cut through forgotten plots, and tenements rose over buried stones. When workers excavated foundations for a new warehouse near the river that spring, they uncovered a rusted metal tag stamped WG 1891. The foreman tossed it aside until a journalist retrieved it, linking it at once to the grave Snatchers of St. Louis. The article stirred brief excitement, but the mayor's office intervened, calling the find industrial scrap. Even so, the newspaper kept the piece alive for a week, and public curiosity flickered again before fading under the city's endless march of progress. In 1903, a flood washed through the low wards, scattering caskets from old paupers' fields into open water. The scene was grotesque yet familiar, bodies surfacing from forgotten soil, as if the river itself rejected the century's clean facade. The history of St. Louis, 1866-1904, later documented that disaster with bureaucratic precision, listing property losses and sanitation, measures but omitting any reference to the legend's locals, muttered. Stories that tied the flood's path directly over the ashes of the Galloway House. A few scholars still sought closure. One, Reverend-turned-historian Josiah Brent, interviewed aging witnesses in 1905. He described them as haunted by a memory they pretend not to own. Mrs. McElroy, then 83, recalled the smell from the cellar. It was like soil after lightning. Brent's notes were never published. His parish burned down 2 years later in what officials called an accidental fire. By 1908, the site of the old property had become a paved yard behind a bottling plant. Workers there spoke of tools going missing, of bottles shattering for no reason, and of hearing twin voices humming beneath the floor when the machinery stopped. Night watchmen swore the hum changed pitch whenever storms gathered over the Mississippi. Few believed them, but none volunteered to patrol the place alone. In 1910, the City Council ordered the last remaining special evidentiary materials destroyed to clear space in the records vault. Renner protested, arguing that erasure would not undo history, only invite repetition. His objection was ignored. He died that winter, his personal notes sealed with his estate. Among them lay one sentence that archivists later copied into the margins of a new register. "What we bury does not stay buried, especially in this city," and so the case closed, officially silent. Yet even today, when fog hangs thick above the riverbanks, old residents claim the ground near Maplewood still exhales faint warmth, an impossible heat rising from nowhere, carrying the sterile scent of earth and medicine mixed. By 1911, few remembered the Galloway name except in whispers. The modern city thrummed with trolleys and electric lamps, yet somewhere beneath the streetcar lines, the old myths persisted. A new generation of clerks managed the municipal archives, and among them was a young woman named Helen Royston, bright, meticulous, determined to finish what her predecessors had left incomplete. Her first assignment was to compile a cross-reference of all missing death certificates from the 1890s. Within weeks, she stumbled across fragments of Renner's destroyed index, still smelling faintly of smoke. Royston's diary, later found in an attic trunk, describes the chill she felt reading the marginalia, short phrases like "no remains," "double entry," and the recurring words "ex terra lux." Thinking it an internal code, she asked her supervisor, who advised her to let sleeping scandals lie. Yet the warning had the opposite effect. She began visiting the public cemeteries after her shifts, comparing tombstone dates to surviving ledgers. At Calvary Cemetery, she found 2 adjacent graves whose markers had been replaced in 1892 by identical stones, names weathered blank. Local gravediggers shrugged, saying the plots had been donated back to the parish decades earlier. Meanwhile, the city's centennial preparations stirred civic pride. Newspapers published nostalgic pieces on St. Louis's transformation from frontier post to metropolis. The History of St. Louis, 1866-1904, was reissued in updated form, and reviewers praised its portrayal of progress, untainted by old superstitions. Still, Some readers noticed the conspicuous omission of any reference to the medical scandals of the 1890s. Royston, reading the edition in her rented room, underlined a sentence in pencil. "Every era must exhume its past to understand its own decay." She added beside it, "Then why do we rebury ours?" In 1913, heavy rain undermined the pavement near Maplewood Avenue, exposing a length of corroded pipe and what appeared to be a brick vault beneath. Workmen reported it to the city engineer, who ordered the site sealed again for safety. Royston happened to pass by that evening. Her notes record a faint odor of metal and vinegar, unmistakably chemical. She returned the next morning, but the street had already been patched. Rumors of her inquiries reached her supervisors, and she was quietly reassigned to another department. Friends said she seemed distant afterward, often sketching twin silhouettes on scrap paper. In her final journal entry, dated August 1914, she wrote, "They were not monsters. They were archivists of the flesh, trying to preserve what time erases." She disappeared the following winter during the influenza outbreak, though no death record survives in her name. By 1917, the Galloway story had vanished from public memory entirely, buried under war headlines and the noise of a changing world. Yet archivists decades later would still find her penciled note tucked inside the reprinted history of St. Louis. The city forgets, but the soil remembers. After 1917, the Great War consumed the world's attention, and St. Louis threw itself into patriotic production. Factories roared, hospitals overflowed, and any whisper of its darker past sank beneath the din of modernity. Yet in quiet corners of the Missouri Historical Society, a few archivists continued to stumble upon the Galloway traces left behind by generations who had tried, unsuccessfully, to erase them. One such archivist was a former newspaperman named Luther Crane, hired in 1918 to inventory damaged files from the courthouse fire of that spring. Among the charred folders, he found a single surviving envelope marked in fading ink, "Galloway as unverified." Inside lay the brass locket engraved Ex Terra Lux, blackened but intact. Crane's curiosity led him to scour earlier references, and it was through his research that the tale re-emerged in intellectual circles. In a short essay published anonymously in the Western Historical Review, he described a pair of resurrectionists whose legacy reached farther than the graves they disturbed. Though he never named the brothers directly, the clues were plain to anyone who remembered the city's 1890s rumors. Crane cross-referenced details with passages in the history of St. Louis, 1866-1904, its careful wording on anatomical procurement controversies suddenly took on new significance when paired with his findings. By 1919, the essay had inspired local historians to debate whether the brothers' acts were criminal or merely premature science. Some argued they sought enlightenment in an era that offered them only obscurity. Others called them opportunists feeding on desperation. The debate spilled from academic halls into taverns and newspaper columns, reviving the legend under a veneer of scholarship. In those same months, the influenza epidemic swept through the city again, filling temporary morgues and overburdening graveyards just as before. Uncollected corpses and hastily dug trenches recalled the grim scenes of 1890, and older residents murmured that the Galloways have returned to collect. Officials dismissed it as hysteria born of fever, yet Crane recorded one peculiar detail: reports from gravediggers of missing bodies during the worst weeks of the outbreak. The records note possible miscounts, but the repetition of that phrase across multiple burial sites left scholars uneasy. That winter, Crane's health declined. Confined to his small apartment overlooking the frozen river, he continued his research, writing by lamplight. Neighbors later testified that he kept the tarnished locket on his desk, polishing it absently as he worked. When he failed to appear at the archive for several days, colleagues forced open his door. He was found seated upright, pen still in hand, his final notes unreadable beneath a water stain from a burst pipe. The coroner ruled natural causes. Among his scattered papers lay a draft foreword for a proposed book. This city, born of mud and light, builds progress upon the bones of its own forgetting. What the brothers began was never finished. It was merely archived, waiting to be reopened. Through the early 1920s, St. Louis began to reinvent itself once more. Jazz spilled from riverfront saloons, the skyline climbed upward, and few wished to recall the city's macabre roots. Yet the legend of the Galloway twins found new life among lecturers, curiosity seekers, and traveling storytellers who repackaged history for entertainment. In 1921, the St. Louis Folklore Society hosted a symposium titled Midwestern Myths and Medical Crimes. One speaker, Professor Edwin Tolliver, presented a paper drawn partly from Luther Crane's posthumous notes, suggesting that the grave snatchers of 1890 were not villains but products of a transitional science, punished for serving progress too well. His tone was academic, yet the audience shivered at the phrase. Tolliver's work revived scholarly attention, and he soon received correspondence from museums and newspapers eager for a sensational feature. The Post-Dispatch ran a Sunday piece headlined, "The Galloway Mystery Revisited, Truth or Tall Tale." Within days, the paper received dozens of letters claiming familial connection to the twins, each story more elaborate than the last. Some insisted the brothers had escaped to New Orleans, others that they joined the army under assumed names. A few letters enclosed crude sketches of the brass locket, proving how deeply that symbol had embedded itself in civic imagination. Curators at the Missouri Historical Society capitalized on the interest. They mounted a small exhibit called Science and Shadows, the Anatomy of the 1890s, featuring medical tools, early surgical manuals, and, at the center, Crane's recovered locket. Its inscription, Ex Terra Lux, gleamed faintly under display lights. Visitors queued around the block. Children pressed their noses to the glass, whispering that they saw twin reflections where only one locket lay. The exhibit catalogue even referenced the history of St. Louis, 1866-1904, to provide historical grounding for the city's complicated relationship with medical innovation, though the entry avoided any explicit mention of the brothers by name. Meanwhile, modern folklorists began collecting oral versions of the story. One recording made in 1923 captured an elderly woman's trembling voice recounting, "They took what the doctors needed, and the earth never forgave them." The archivist who transcribed the tape noted intermittent static like two voices overlapping. Whether mechanical fault or coincidence, listeners found it unsettling. That same year, vandals broke into the museum after hours, stealing nothing but the locket. Guards heard the alarm, but found only an open window and muddy footprints leading toward the river. The exhibit closed quietly, replaced by a less controversial display on pioneer tools. The theft was never solved. In 1925, Professor Tolliver suffered a breakdown during a lecture at Washington University. Witnesses said he froze mid-sentence, staring at the back wall as though seeing someone unseen. His last coherent words were, "They are still taking notes." He retired soon after, and the university sealed his papers until decades later. By decade's end, the Galloway case had once again slipped from scholarship to superstition, a cyclical burial of memory and rediscovery that mirrored the very acts that had defined it. But under the hum of modern jazz and streetcars, a whisper endured, the belief that every advance the city celebrated had cost it something sacred, something still unsettled beneath its shining streets. By 1927, St. Louis glowed with electric marquees and the restless rhythm of the jazz age. But just beyond the neon brilliance, the old stories began to breathe again. The theft of the Galloway locket from the museum had not faded from public curiosity. Instead, it evolved into a modern ghost tale passed around speakeasies and university dormitories alike. Students claimed that on certain nights, the Mississippi reflected not moonlight but a dull, golden shimmer, the light from the earth, they said, invoking that same cryptic Latin motto that had haunted local history for decades, the Missouri folklore. Quarterly published an article that year titled Echoes from Grave Hill, the City's Forgotten Anatomists. The author, folklorist Mabel Keating, sought to separate rumor from fact. She interviewed aging residents who still remembered the fires of 1891 and pieced together fragments of testimony long buried in municipal ledgers. Her article leaned heavily on the history of St. Louis, 1866-1904, noting how civic reform and industrial growth had overshadowed the moral ambiguities of scientific ambition. Keating concluded that the brothers were neither monsters nor martyrs, but mirror reflections of a city willing to trade sanctity for progress. The issue sold out within days. Encouraged by her success, Keating organized a public lecture at the old Masonic Hall. Witnesses described the hall filled to capacity, the audience half drunk on fascination, half fearful of what they might learn. As Keating read aloud from her notes, the lights flickered. She laughed it off as faulty wiring, but the crowd stirred uneasily. When the projectionist attempted to show lantern slides of the burned property, each plate appeared clouded by a milky film that obscured the image, except one, which displayed two faint figures standing at the cellar door. The projectionist swore the glass had been clean. After the lecture, Keating reportedly received anonymous letters urging her to abandon her research. One, unsigned but typed neatly, read, "Some collections are meant to stay closed." The brothers kept order where chaos wished to rise. She dismissed it as the work of pranksters, but months later her apartment was broken into. Only her notes and the copy of Crane's essay were taken. She left St. Louis soon after, relocating to Chicago, where she continued writing on folklore, but never again mentioned the twins. Around the same time, construction crews expanding the streetcar line uncovered fragments of brickwork near the old Maplewood site. Beneath them lay scorched timbers and rusted iron fittings shaped like hooks. A city engineer filed a brief note. Residual structure, possibly storage. Recommend backfill. The debris was reburied the same week. By 1930, the Depression had swept across the Midwest, and survival replaced superstition in public concern. Yet storytellers continued spinning the Galloway legend for spare coins in bars and theaters. In every version, the theme remained: two men chasing light through darkness, and a city too eager to let them vanish. Beneath modern progress, something ancient and uneasy still pulsed, a quiet conviction that the story was not done, merely waiting for the right excavation to bring it back into the air. The Great Depression carved its own scars into St. Louis. Bread lines wrapped around Union Market, factories shuttered, and whole families drifted from house to house along the river's edge. Yet even amid hardship, stories endured, cheap entertainment for weary souls. By 1932, the Galloway tale had transformed from whispered sin into stage material. A traveling troupe called the Missouri Minstrels of Mystery performed a dramatized version titled The Grave Snatchers, a tale of science and shame. The show blended fact with lurid invention, lightning flashing across painted backdrops, twin actors in black coats digging beneath a papier-mâché moon. Crowds gasped, laughed, and left uneasy, uncertain where fiction ended. Scholars of the time considered such performances a symptom of cultural fatigue. The St. Louis Star ran an editorial decrying morbid nostalgia for a past best forgotten. Yet within weeks, letters poured in from readers demanding reprints of the old accounts. Among them appeared one from a retired archivist who claimed to have worked with Luther Crane before his death. The letter mentioned a missing box of documents labeled E.T. La Private. The editor dismissed it as a prank, but that acronym, Ex Terra Lux, soon began reappearing as graffiti on alley walls near the old riverfront. By 1934, university folklore students were collecting such urban myths as examples of Depression-era hauntings. Professor Keating's unpublished notes, recovered from Chicago after her death, circulated among them, strengthening the legend's academic weight. Each retelling stitched new details atop the old: spectral wagons rolling through fog, whispering voices under the streetcar tracks, or lanterns glimpsed in stormwater tunnels. Still, behind the embroidery lingered a core of truth recognizable from the history of St. Louis, 1866 and 1904. The uneasy marriage of progress and moral compromise that had birthed the city's modern self. In 1935, Works Progress Administration crews widening the sewer line near Maplewood unearthed a row of rusted hooks embedded in masonry. The site engineer, weary of reporters, filed his account tersely. Old drainage fittings unsafe for reuse. The pieces were carted off and melted down. A week later, 2 laborers on the project quit abruptly, claiming they'd heard tapping from inside the tunnel wall. Their foreman noted only that the men refused to re-enter, and the matter was closed. Meanwhile, a new generation of writers seized on the myth. In dime magazines and pulp weeklies, the Galloway brothers reappeared as gothic heroes or ghastly villains. depending on the editor's taste. One story portrayed them as alchemists, seeking eternal preservation, another as pioneers of forensic science betrayed by their city. Each version pushed the real history further into shadow, yet the motif of twin seekers pulling light from Earth persisted unchanged. By 1938, the last surviving eyewitnesses to the original events had died. The story no longer belonged to memory, but to imagination, drifting between folklore and fact like fog over the river. And though the city modernized, its streets paved, its skyline rising, the foundation of the Galloway house remained buried beneath concrete, undisturbed but never forgotten. Locals still crossed that block quickly on cold nights, whispering that beneath the pavement, tools sometimes rang faintly against stone, as if unseen hands still worked by lantern light in the endless dark below. When the 1940s arrived, St. Louis was once again a city in motion, factories beating like iron hearts for the war effort, trains streaming out loaded with soldiers, and ration posters plastering the brick facades that once hid older secrets. Yet even amid patriotism and blackout drills, the legend of the Galloway brothers refused to die. It lingered in jokes told by machinists working night shifts, in whispers among students quartered near the river, and in a handful of letters exchanged between historians who suspected there was still truth buried under myth. In 1942, a civil defense warden named Harold Denton documented an unusual incident while inspecting an air raid shelter on Maplewood Avenue. His report noted subterranean vibration and a sulfurous odor unlike gas. When the crew broke through a section of cracked pavement to investigate, they found a hollow cavity lined with blackened brick. Photographs taken before the cavity was resealed show a half-melted iron ring, remarkably similar to those described in the 1891 investigation. The War Office dismissed it as coincidence, a forgotten storm drain, but local papers printed the story under the headline, "Echo from the Old Cellar." That same year, University archivist Miriam Blake began assembling a wartime exhibit on civic endurance. While searching through sealed vaults, she uncovered a mislabeled bundle of late 19th century correspondence. One envelope bore the embossed initials AG and WG, its wax seal cracked with age. Inside was a single sheet of stationery containing 3 words, Ex Terra Lux. Blake mentioned her find in a radio interview promoting the exhibit, referring casually to those old resurrectionists of the 1890s. The phrase reignited public fascination overnight. Listeners wrote to the station demanding more details. Callers recited versions of the story handed down from grandparents. One elderly veteran recalled serving as a messenger for the police during the 1891 fire, claiming he saw 2 shapes walking into smoke but none coming out. Blake, overwhelmed, asked to withdraw from publicity. She told a colleague privately that she had begun receiving phone calls at night, silent except for the faint scrape of metal before disconnection. By 1945, the legend had been folded into wartime folklore. Soldiers passing through Union Station joked that the brothers were still digging up recruits, while teachers used the story to warn children against curiosity untempered by conscience. Yet a few academics sought a more sober interpretation. A brief article in the Midwest Historical Review analyzed the myth as collective guilt embodied through twin figures representing moral bifurcation. The author cited passages from the History of St. Louis, 1866-1904, describing the city's rapid industrial expansion and ethical growing pains. To him, the brothers symbolized progress unrestrained, ambition without mercy. After VJ Day, St. Louis celebrated victory with parades that rolled over Maplewood Avenue itself. Beneath the brass bands and fluttering flags, no one noticed the faint discoloration of asphalt, where heat once rose from the earth. When municipal engineers repaved the stretch the following spring, they struck an air pocket and heard a hollow ring echo up from below. The foreman made a note on his clipboard, "Minor void beneath surface, filled with concrete." It was the last official mention of the site for another generation. As the 1950s dawned, the world had changed beyond recognition, but the soil beneath St. Louis still held its whispers. The war's end brought prosperity and suburban sprawl. Streets widened, houses gleamed, and few citizens spared thought for the ghosts underfoot. Yet with progress came curiosity, an urge to reclaim the forgotten. In 1952, the Historical Society proposed a City of Shadows exhibit, meant to explore unsolved legends. Among the files Miriam Blake once catalogued lay a yellowed folder marked Medical Irregularities, 1890-1892. Inside rested an empty sleeve labelled Galloway Papers. The curator, Eleanor Price, noted the absence in her log, unaware she was reopening the city's oldest wound. Price's interest turned obsession. She began tracing every surviving mention of the brothers, visiting libraries, morgues, even interviewing descendants of the officials named in the earliest reports. One aging clerk claimed his grandfather had carried a payment envelope from the medical college to those two doctors who worked by lantern. Price cross-checked the anecdote against the history of St. Louis, 1866-1904, finding a quiet paragraph on unauthorized procurement of anatomical material. It confirmed her suspicion. Official historians had known, but chosen silence. Television was entering its golden age, and local producers sought macabre content for late-night audiences. In 1954, Channel 11 News aired a Halloween special titled The Grave Snatchers of St. Louis. Actors in stovepipe hats dramatized the tale, while commentators framed it as an early example of civic corruption meeting science. Viewers loved it. Letters flooded in demanding replays. Yet following the broadcast, the network reported technical difficulties, equipment shorting out when the cellar reenactment scene aired. Engineers blamed moisture, though no fault was found. Meanwhile, excavation for a new telephone conduit near Maplewood disturbed more than dirt. Workers uncovered fragments of curved glass, possibly laboratory vials fused into slag. When touched, the pieces emitted a faint metallic odor, sharp and sterile. City supervisors ordered immediate disposal, citing health concerns. That night, residents nearby reported tremors lasting several seconds, strong enough to rattle window panes. The local paper mentioned it briefly, minor ground subsidence. But Price recorded the event in her private diary beside a single Latin phrase, ex terra lux, again. By 1957, she presented her findings at the Midwest Historical Conference, arguing the Galloways symbolized the unresolved moral architecture of American progress. Her paper, though measured and footnoted, drew controversy. One elderly attendee approached afterward and whispered, "They never left. They were simply absorbed." The man refused to give his name. Price's notes end abruptly in December 1958. Her colleagues assumed she'd retired quietly, but her apartment was found empty except for her typewriter, still loaded with paper. The final line read, "Light persists where earth is thin." Over the next decade, the Historical Society shelved all projects related to the case. The history of St. Louis remained the only sanctioned chronicle of the period, its careful omissions untouched. Yet beneath the glossy post-war cityscape, those omissions still glowed faintly, an invisible circuitry of memory humming beneath every polished street, waiting for the next curious hand to brush away the dust. By the early 1960s, St. Louis had entered another phase of reinvention. New highways cutting through old neighborhoods, towers replacing row houses, and the hum of progress drowning the city's quieter history. Yet beneath this modern sheen, the Galloway legend flickered one last time before fading into the undertow of folklore. In 1961, a redevelopment project near Maplewood required deep excavation for the foundation of a new municipal annex. Surveyors recorded an irregular magnetic reading under the ground where the Galloway property had once stood. The crew dug cautiously, uncovering a buried stone slab, unmarked, cracked, and blackened by age. Beneath it was a void. Foreman Samuel Greer filed the incident in his log. Chamber discovered at 12 feet. Dimensions indeterminate. Air stale but dry. When he descended to inspect it, the men above heard him exclaim something indistinct, followed by the metallic ring of his flashlight striking stone. He emerged minutes later, pale and silent, refusing to speak of what he saw. The chamber was filled with concrete, that same afternoon under instruction from city engineers. No photographs were taken. That summer, historian Eleanor Price's personal papers surfaced in a pawnshop trunk purchased by a collector of Civil War relics. Among receipts and correspondence lay one letter addressed to the archivist of shadows. Its single paragraph read, "They sought not death, but continuity." The city mistook one for the other. The collector donated the letter anonymously to the Historical Society, where it rests today, filed between medical ethics 19th century and urban legends. In 1965, The History of St. Louis, 1866-1904, was reprinted once more, this time as a glossy centennial edition. A new preface acknowledged rumors and legends surrounding the city's early medical community, though still without naming the Galloways. For readers who knew, the mention was a ghostly nod, a faint acknowledgement that the myth had outlived the facts. Younger scholars debated whether the brothers were real at all, citing the absence of verifiable birth records, yet the pattern of erased documents spoke louder than any birth certificate could. By the decade's close, the old Maplewood block was gone, replaced by a car park whose concrete never quite settled evenly. Maintenance crews reported recurring sinkholes, no matter how often the foundation was repaired. At night, steam vents along the pavement emitted faint plumes that smelled of formalin and rain. Drivers waiting at red lights claimed to see two silhouettes in the mist, standing shoulder to shoulder before dissolving into shadow. Officially, the case of the Galloway brothers ended in silence, but silence in St. Louis has a way of echoing. Each retelling, whether in lecture halls, pulp magazines, or whispered barroom tales, became another layer of soil pressed over the same uneasy truth. Progress built upward, yet the past remained patient beneath it, sealed but breathing. And on rare, humid nights when the river mist drifts through the streets, locals say the ground still exhales a slow, sterile heat, proof, perhaps, that the city's oldest experiment never truly ended, only changed its form.